Well, good evening. It's always my favorite part. I get applause just for walking out here. My name's Andrew Finstuen, and I'm the Dean of the Honors College and the Executive Director for the Institute for Advancing American Values. And our program, the Distinguished Lecture Series, is one of our signature programs of our institute. And in a moment, we'll hear from tonight's distinguished speaker, Dr. Jonathan Haidt. I want to confess a rookie move, which is I just had a sip of water and spilled all over my notes. So if I screw up the introduction, it's my fault. The Distinguished Lecture Series has welcomed speakers for more than 2 decades. Last fall, we had Drs. Cornel West and Robert George. We've also heard from Jason Riley of the Wall Street Journal, author Margaret Atwood, former National Security Advisor Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, author and political theorist Dr. Danielle Allen. Next fall, on October 25th, less than 2 weeks from the presidential election, we'll have New York Times columnist David Brooks as our speaker. At the top of the hour, we'll transition to an open Q&A. To my right and to my left, there are microphones positioned at the stage. You're welcome to, at the conclusion of Dr. Haidt's remarks, come up and have time for Q&A. We'll have about 20 or 30 minutes for that. We may not get to everyone's questions. We also ask, if possible, to defer the first 2 questions to students. If we have students in the audiences that would like to address Dr. Haidt at the conclusion of his remarks. I have a few thank yous to offer. I'd first like to thank Dr. Isaac Castellano, who's the Associate Director of the Institute, and he's helped with this program and so many other of our activities. Our lecture tonight is sponsored by Buffington Moore McNeil, a wealth management firm supporting the series since 2016. We're grateful for their support. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. Support also comes from Boise State Public Radio, another longstanding supporter of our program. I'd also like to recognize Lieutenant Governor Scott Bedke and several members of the Idaho State Legislature who've joined us for tonight's presentation. The Institute for Advancing American Values emerged from a great collaboration between university colleagues, community members, including a wonderful Institute Advisory Board, External Advisory Board, in support of the university as a place of idea exchange. A tradition that stretches back 1,000 years, which speaks to the long-term value of honoring different convictions while insisting on the preservation of the whole. The Institute has been busy pursuing this mission for open inquiry, freedom of expression, and the examination of multiple viewpoints about the values that have defined and shaped America. In particular, I'd like for you to check out our Idaho Listens program, a statewide venture that asks everyday Idahoans to speak about what they value and why to an audience that remains silent. The silence serves one of our purposes to foster listening to understand. We've traveled to Idaho Falls, Coeur d'Alene, and next month we'll be in Caldwell. You can find out all of our activities on our website, including Idaho Public Television did a documentary about Idaho Listens. I encourage you to see it as we continue to work for greater trust and relationship across this state. The Institute sought out Dr. Jonathan Haidt precisely for his contributions to securing universities as a place of idea exchange. And it's my pleasure to introduce him now. Jonathan Haidt is a social psychologist at New York University's Stern School of Business. Haidt's research examines the intuitive foundations of morality and how morality varies across cultural and political divisions. He's the author of The Happiness Hypothesis and the New York Times bestsellers The Righteous Mind and The Coddling of the American Mind in 2018 with Greg Lukianoff. He has given 4 TED Talks. You can find his work in that medium. In 2019, he was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, one of the most prestigious honors a scholar can achieve. Since 2018, he's been studying the contributions of social media to the decline of teen mental health and the rise of political dysfunction. His next book, The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. And it will be published very shortly, March 26th, 2024. Dr. Haidt writes excellent books, and he takes action as well to ensure that his research on moral psychology helps people better understand one another and helps institutions work better for the common good. For example, he co-founded Heterodox Academy, campus organizations that flourish across this country dedicated to open inquiry, constructive disagreement, and viewpoint diversity. He's worked with a number of corporations and founded ethicalsystems.org, inspired by another book project on capitalism and morality. With relationship to our liberal democracy, he co-founded the Constructive Dialogue Institute, and he serves on the board of Braver Angels. Schools and families are one of his concerns as well in terms of how we are overprotecting our kids, according to his research. So he co-founded letgrow.org, an organization advocating for childhood independence, noting that when parents step back, kids step up. He's concerned about social media, active in a community of research who are studying the transformative effects of social media on adolescent mental health, as his latest book describes and goes into detail. So tonight, Professor Haidt will be speaking on the meltdown of the university and ideas for rebuilding it. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Haidt to the podium.
Okay, well, good evening, Boise. First, I'm having vocal cord problems over the last few months, so I have to speak quietly into a mic, but this should be good, right? You can all hear me? Okay, good. So this is my first time in Boise, first time in Idaho, and I'm learning a lot. One thing is that it is actually possible to say hello to people in elevators that you don't know. Like, I didn't know that that was a thing that you could do. And I've learned that you just love the color blue. You have this just inordinate fascination with the color blue. And I've learned that this university is actually very healthy. So I met with about a dozen faculty members today, Heterodox Academy members and non-members. Then I met with about 24 students. And even though my talk is titled The Meltdown of the University, this university is not melting down. The problems I'm talking about, problems you might have heard of, they're very common in the Ivy League schools all along the West Coast, from Southern California up to Seattle. They're at the elite liberal arts colleges. But at schools in this region, the problems that I'm talking about, there are some hints of them, but it's really not bad here. So you've got a good thing going here. You've got a great university. But the things I'm talking about are affecting the whole country, the whole higher ed sector, and I'll also talk about what's affecting Gen Z. So in this audience, raise your hand if you are a parent who has children born after 1995. Raise your hand high. Okay, so a lot of you, wow, like half of you, I'd say, almost half of you. So your kids are Gen Z, I'll be talking about that. Raise your hand if you are a student here at Boise State or any other school at any level, undergrad, grad, raise your hand high. Okay, a bunch of students. And then raise your hand if you're just a member of the community who wandered in here by accident. No, okay. Okay. So let's get started. I have a lot that I want to talk about. There's so much going on in this world. And as Andrew said, I'm a social psychologist. It's a great time to be a social psychologist studying the craziness of our society. So I want to start, before I talk about universities, I want to talk about another institution, the U.S. military. And as you can see, this is public confidence, and as you can see in this graph, there was a loss of confidence after the Vietnam War, very low in the 70s, but gradually the military regained the trust of the country and became the most respected institution, major institution in the country, although they had a drop there. And then since 2018 or so, there's been a big drop. What caused that? Well, part of the drop was because the military, some elements of it, they abandoned their central mission. Their mission is to defend the United States of America. But there was a series of scandals where it became clear that certain branches, especially the Air Force, were taking on a second mission, which is to serve Jesus Christ and to advance Jesus' goals on earth. And if the military, especially the Air Force, if they're doing this, of course, this is going to alienate a lot of people. And so when we look, this is data from Pew as to how much Americans trust the military. The military is having a negative effect on the U.S. And what you see is that Christians disagreed with that. Christians have a positive view of the military, and that's been true all along. Non-Christians have a less positive view of the military, so that's not really surprising. But what happens as we get into this more recent era? Nothing happens over there, but over here, look what happens. So it's really non-Christians suddenly lost their faith in the US military, and I think it's because the military was engaging in really religious proselytizing, which it shouldn't be doing. Now, none of this is true. I made this up. Now, actually, this part is actually true, but this was a minor scandal. I don't think this is what caused the drop in trust in the military. But I made this up because I want you to imagine how horrible it would be if a major American institution abandoned its mission and took on a separate mission, an ideological or political or religious mission. That would be horrible. And that's what's happened to universities. So we used to have possibly the greatest brand in the world. This is a listing of the top universities in the world, and they're almost all, as you can see, they're almost all in the United States. And this is a British list. It's not even an American list. By any reckoning, American higher ed is the best in the world. People want to come from all over the world. Other countries copy us. So we developed an incredible reputation, and our brand was based on two pillars. One was absolute honesty. You can't be a scholar or a scientist if you make stuff up, if you lie, if you distort the truth. We have an absolute commitment to the truth, to saying things that are literally true, and we have intellectual excellence. We select people for their accomplishments, for their intelligence, for their hard work, and we produce the greatest scientists and scholars. That's what our brand was based on, these two pillars. And when people look at an institution with these traits, they trust them. And we had the trust of the country. Until 2015. In 2015, all of a sudden, universities seemed to abandon their mission and go in for a kind of political activism. This was the famous scene in the courtyard at Yale where students are yelling at Professor Nicholas Christakis and insulting him and behaving really terribly towards him because his wife wrote a memo that questioned a Halloween guidance policy, a DEI policy. The students submitted a long list of demands to the president of the university, who came back and agreed with them and said, yes, we'll make all these reforms. He did not defend the Christakises. That was the beginning of a long series of protests on campus in which campus activists would protest speakers, they'd shout down speakers. There wasn't much violence except for 2017. There was actually a fair amount of violence on campus in 2017. Students, when Charles Murray tried to speak, students attacked him and injured a professor who was with him. So it was a period of intense political activism, which was especially, a lot of it was focused on shutting down and shouting down conservatives or anyone who questioned certain policies that were popular on the left. And so it's even going on today. This was just a year ago. At Stanford, students shouted down a Republican judge, and the dean of something or other came to basically support the students and insult him, a real low point. So this is the real data. This is data from Pew, not about the military. I just doctored that. This is the original data about what do you think about the universities? Are colleges having a negative effect on the US? And what you see is that Democrats have a positive view all the way along. Republicans used to have a positive view. I mean, it's so 50, it's just above the midpoint, but that's where they were then. But what happens after 2015? They all see the videos of students screaming at conservatives, yelling at them, insulting them, excluding them. And guess what? Republicans lose their trust in universities. Of course they do. How would they not? But it's actually worse than this, because this is a graph that's well known in higher ed from Pew data. But last June, or a little later, Gallup put out a survey that allowed us to see not just Democrats, Republicans, but look at the independents. So if higher ed had the trust of all three groups to some degree, and then lost it, especially among Republicans and independents, what does that mean? It's not just the Republicans. It's that the only people who really support universities are the blue team. that universities have become part of the blue team, and that's tragic. We need our universities. We can't have them be just political actors. This data was collected in June 2023, before October 7th. So October 7th was an awful day, the Hamas terrorist attack on Israel. And what did we hear from campus? On October 7th and 8th, we heard campus groups celebrating the attack. Not that this was a widespread thing, but there were a number of instances that got a lot of publicity. So Americans are seeing students at Harvard and elsewhere celebrating the attack, even before Israel had counterattacked. We see some professors praising it. And this is my building at NYU. Students had put up posters of kidnapped Israelis, and other NYU students, they were caught on video, other NYU students were tearing them down, and then so we've had a really difficult fall on campus because of this, and I think it led to an incredibly important event. Raise your hand if you know what this is, if you've seen this. Okay, so most of you have. This is the 3 university presidents testifying in response to a committee investigating anti-Semitism on campus. And the responses were abysmal, they were scripted, they were hypocritical, they said we allow free speech, and it was clear that they were being hypocrites and dishonest. And so this really, I think, brought some of the rot in higher ed out to the public. How is it that we're so exquisitely sensitive to any word? If you say any word that anyone takes to be offensive, you can be punished, you can be expelled. But yet, chanting from the river to the sea, well, that's okay, that's free speech. Now, I think students should be allowed to say such things, but then universities should actually be consistent in letting people speak. My point is this. Oh, it gets worse. So one of the presidents resigned under pressure from alumni and donors. Another then went on to another scandal because it turns out that she had plagiarized her dissertation, including the acknowledgments. How do you plagiarize the acknowledgments of your dissertation? But somehow she found a way. But even more disturbing than that is that a lot of, I don't know how many, but a number of professors defended her and said, well, it's not really plagiarism. Like, no, this is clearly plagiarism. Why are you doing this? They were being dishonest. They were putting the defense of an African-American president ahead of their respect for the truth. And so all of this, I think, has brought about a complete collapse in the brand of American higher ed. How did we commit brand suicide so that you can get essays like this in the Wall Street Journal? Higher ed has become a threat to America. If higher ed was shut down, we'd be better off, some conservatives think. How did we come this far? How did we commit brand suicide? I've been studying this since 2011 when I noticed that everyone in my field was on the left. There were no Republicans, no conservatives in social psychology. There was one, and I was very lucky to have known him, but that was it, just the one. So how did we do it? I've been studying political diversity. I created Heterodox Academy. I wrote this Atlantic essay with Greg Lukianoff, which turned into a book, The Coddling the American Mind. And then most recently, I've been following this up with my current book coming out in 2 weeks on the anxious generation. So let me tell you a little bit about what I found. I'm going to go through sort of 3 areas. I want to present some research in 3 areas to you, which I hope will help you make sense of what's going on. So the first is the mindset of Gen Z. Gen Z is really different from the millennials, and here's how. So when I present this to students, I often start by asking, what's the most fundamental question in life? Just I ask you, just yell it out. What do you think is the most fundamental question? What do you think? Why are we here? What else? What's the truth? How can I be happy? What else? What's going on? That's a pretty good question. How about what the hell is going on? Well, actually, if you take this literally, fundament means foundation, the thing upon which all else is built. So I would submit to you that the most fundamental question in life is approach or avoid. Because as soon as life got the ability to move, and here's an article saying that it looks like maybe 3.4 billion years ago, like soon after bacteria, some of them developed the ability to move. And once you can move, then the question becomes, which way? And a lot of the rest of evolution is to help guide which way. So if you look at a fish brain, it's got all these things, all these sensory things that connect to motor things, but ultimately they're trying to optimize the question of, do you go towards the light or away from it, towards the more salt or away, towards the warmer or the cold, The brain helps the animal navigate a complex terrain to optimize survival and reproduction. Now in the human brain, it's so big and so convoluted. We have this gigantic frontal cortex that has to wrinkle itself to have more surface area. And there are two functional systems in the brain. They're not quite as localized as it appears here, but to some extent, there's what's called the behavioral activation system, where we pursue goals, and it's partially localized on the front left. And the behavioral inhibition system is more front right for avoid thinking. But I'm going to give them more intuitive names, which are discover mode and defend mode. We can be in one or the other, we can't be in both. If you're really afraid, you're not curious. And if you're curious, you're probably not very afraid. And when a student comes to campus, let's look at freshmen arriving on campus, if they're in discover mode, they're going to see a world of possibilities opening up before them. I remember feeling like a kid in a candy shop. We got this thick blue book full of hundreds of possible courses. It was I loved looking through it and imagining the things that I could learn if I wanted to. And so we want our students to be in discover mode, not defend mode. In defend mode, the brain is set to see everything as a threat. This is what you feel if you're being attacked. And so if students are coming to campus in defend mode, they're not going to learn very much. And that's what happened. This graph shows the rates of various ailments that students had. In 2012, all the college students were millennials, just about. And then as we go on, as Gen Z begins to arrive around 2014, look what happens. What's that yellow line? The yellow line is psychological disabilities. That's the big difference between the generations. If you were born in 1993, you probably are not depressed and anxious. And if you're born in 1998, you probably, well, it's not literally the majority, but you're much more likely to be depressed and anxious if you were born after 1996. Now I can show you a lot more about this. We have to drill down, because it's not all mental illnesses. It's overwhelmingly anxiety and depression. In all the graphs I'll show you, if you stop collecting data in 2010 or 2011, you see no trend. Things were flat, maybe even slightly improving for the millennials compared to Gen X before them. But as we go into the 2010s, sometime between 2010 and 2015, all of these lines go up. And it's not that everyone is getting depressed and anxious. It's only the youngest people. It's only Gen Z and some younger millennials. And there's a big gendered component to this, especially to anxiety and depression. So these are the percent of American teens, not college students, who had a major depression, 5 out of 9 symptoms on a checklist. And look what happens as we get into this period. So it's up for both, but girls start off at a higher level, and then they go way, way high, to the point where, if 30% of American teenage girls have had a major depression in the last year, then being depressed is just a very normal part of being an American girl. It's just part of life. It's just a lot of girls are very depressed. And also, I want you to notice, you see the COVID bump there? COVID made things a little bit worse, not much. It was hard for many individual kids, but whatever's happening wasn't caused by COVID. It was caused by something in the early 2010s. Now, there's an interesting twist to this. As you dig into the data more and more, you find all kinds of variables about who was swept away and who wasn't. And it turns out that if you break the data up by both gender and politics, you see something very interesting. So it's long been known. This is a measure of depressive affect from questions asked in a national survey. It's long been known that liberals are a little bit more depressed and anxious than conservatives. That's been discussed for decades. It's a fairly well-known finding. It's not a big difference, but it shows up repeatedly. And you see it here until 2012. What happens after 2012? The liberal girls go up first and fastest. Whatever's happening, it affected girls on the left the most. Conservatives, male and female, went up. They did go up too. Everybody goes up. There's no group that doesn't go up. But this is an interesting political difference, which I'll come back to. Whatever was happening was a set of new ideas, very popular on the left, that was about, I'm a victim everything is oppressive, and therefore I'm fighting back by attacking you as an oppressor. And so we began seeing articles like this, and so almost all the faculty are on the left. They were even attacking the left-leaning faculty, such as Nicholas Christakis or this person. Now, at the time, as Greg and I were writing our book and publishing on this topic, some people said, "Oh, you guys are exaggerating. There isn't even a mental health crisis. It's just self-report data. You're starting a moral panic. This is just that Gen Z is comfortable talking about it. They're comfortable admitting it. That's a good thing." But if that was the case, then we wouldn't see the same patterns in behavior. We'd only see it in what young people say about their mental health. But guess what? When we look at emergency room visits, psychiatric emergency room visits for self-harm, a kid who cut herself and is bleeding, cut deliberately or took an overdose, took all of her psychiatric medications in a single dose. What we see is, again, no trend until 2010, and then this happens. Now here I've plotted the data for 10 to 14-year-old girls. The numbers are higher for older girls. It's more of a mid-teen thing to do. But the biggest changes we always see are for the 10 to 14-year-old girls. They did not used to cut themselves. It was a very rare thing for an 11 or 12-year-old girl to be cutting herself until 2012 or so. Now it's not so uncommon. And we see the same thing for suicide. So girls make more suicide attempts, but boys end up committing more suicide at higher rates because they usually use guns and tall buildings, bridges. They use irreversible means, whereas girls more often use reversible means. So there are different motivations and different intentions around suicide. So boys have higher rates, and look what happens after 2010. So it's way up for both boys and girls. It's more than doubled for the for the younger teen boys and girls. And look at this extraordinary thing that happened in 2013. A 67% increase in suicide in a single year? That's almost a statistical impossibility. It must be an anomaly. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of a rise up to 134% increase. And guess what? It's not just us. Exact same thing happens in the UK. This is self-harm data from UK teenagers. Same thing in Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And we found this pattern in Scandinavia as well. So it's not in all countries, but it's in all the English-speaking countries. Most of the Protestant countries, the freest countries, are the ones where kids get swept away. Oh, this is, Australian data, same thing. Now, why? Why is this happening at the same time in many countries, and why is it hitting young girls the most? Any theories? Any hypotheses? Social media, that's right. So that, I believe, is the explanation. That's what my book is about. And I won't go into all the other theories here. I'll just note that there is no alternative theory. No one has even proposed an alternative. People say, it was, 2012, the Newtown school shooting, and our kids have these lockdown drills, and of course they're afraid. They're told that they're going to be killed in school. That's very plausible. But why is it happening in New Zealand? Why is it happening in Canada? The global financial crisis, well, that was 2008. By 2013, the economy has been healing for years. So there's no other explanation on the table other than the change in technology. And what I'm arguing in my book is that between 2010 and 2015, we rewired childhood so that it's not anything like what we evolved to have. We ended the play-based childhood and we swapped in the phone-based childhood. So you can see this happening in this graph. So I didn't realize until I found this data that the internet didn't just keep becoming part of our lives. It came in two waves. So first, a lot of us older people remember getting a PC, a computer. You put it on your desk. You can do WordStar. You can do word processing, amazing. And there's some video games. And then we got the internet. We had to put your phone on a hook, and it made a noise. It was really slow. So we had, but it was pretty cool that you could connect and you could get all this information. So the PC and internet, those rise up very much in the 90s and into the 2000s. What happens to teen mental health? It gets a little bit better, no problem. What happens to democracy? Greatest period of democracy in human history. More democracies, fewer autocracies. The internet's going to be amazing, right? It's going to knock down tyrants everywhere, we thought. But then the second wave comes in, the smartphone and social media. Social media begins around 2003 with like Friendster and MySpace and then Facebook. This is the second wave. Technology is adopted faster than anything in human history. And what happens as soon as teens move their social lives from flip phones, which are fine, they're not harmful, when teens trade in their flip phones for smartphones, what happens? Their mental health collapses. Now, why did it collapse? Moving from flip phones to smartphones loaded with social media apps, which you're looking at, the latest data is 9 hours a day on your phone, not counting school or homework, just 9 hours a day of leisure use on the phone. That pushes out almost everything else. There really isn't time to do anything else, such as read a book or see a friend. So this is the amount of time that Americans of different ages used to spend with friends every day. And as you see, young people, 15 to 24, used to spend a lot of time. Older people are married, they've got jobs, they're not hanging out with their buddies all day long. But what happens when we get into the 2010s? This. Time with friends plunges for young people. And check this out. 2019, this data was collected before COVID. And now look at the data for 2020. This is after COVID lockdowns. Do you see the COVID effect there? I don't. Gen Z had been social distancing. As soon as they got their phones, they started social distancing. They were almost done by 2019. So when COVID came in, it seemed disruptive, but it's not like they were hanging out with their friends before COVID. Instead, they were doing this, because even if they're with their friends, they're doing this. Now, this was generated by AI. This is not realistic, but this wasn't. And you'll see this whenever you see kids hanging out. If you stop in a school, middle school at recess, if they don't ban phones, this is what recess looks like. And we start them early. We don't wait for middle school. We give our children toy phones so that they can be just like mom and dad. And if you're coaching a soccer game and your little daughter is with you, just give her your phone. She'll sit there quietly and you can go coach the soccer game. And we give kids not just one screen, but multiple screens. This is a little image on TikTok, and the father was very proud of his son. Look, watch this. The son's amazing, isn't he amazing? Look how fast he is. Now imagine if that's what you do for hours a day while your brain is developing. That's going to have an effect. So what I'm trying to tell you is that part of the giant change that happened on campus in 2015 or so was that Gen Z arrived, and they were in defend, a lot of them were in defend mode. They were anxious, depressed, fragile, overprotected, not ready to live independently. Now, that was just one factor affecting the universities. I spent a lot of time on that because it's what my new book is on, and I know from audiences, whenever there are parents are desperate to understand what the hell is happening to our kids. But now let me turn more directly to the university. So I found, since I've been studying the loss of professionalism in higher ed, I find the word telos is incredibly useful. So telos, like, you know, the teleology, like what is the purpose at which this aims. So Aristotle used to use one kind of causality is teleological. Like, why did he do this? Because he's a doctor and he is aiming to heal the patient. The telos of a doctor is to heal. The telos of a knife is to cut. So if I show you a knife and I say, this is a really good knife, can't cut anything, but it's a great knife, you'd say, well, you've misunderstood what a knife is. Like, that's not a knife if it doesn't cut. So healing is the telos of a physician. What's the telos of a university? Call it out. What do you think it is? Teaching. What else? Truth. Pursuit of truth. Thank you. That is what our universities have said about themselves. So this is a famous painting by Raphael. It's called The School of Athens. It shows Plato and Aristotle and all these other people. If you look, what are they doing? Are they playing? Are they fighting? What are they doing? They're talking, discussing, debating, and learning together. And this is why we call ourselves the Academy. It's from Plato's Academy. So as Andrew said, our universities are 1,000 years old, going back to the medieval universities. But our conception of ourselves goes back to ancient Greece, and the philosophers sitting around discussing, debating, drinking wine in the symposium. That's what we think of ourselves as, and it's a great vision of how to pursue truth. And you can see that this is our mission on the crests of many of our schools. So Harvard, this is what's so funny, is the president of Harvard is the biggest plagiarist we've ever seen. Lux et Veritas at Yale, the same idea. And I taught for many years at UVA, where this was emblazoned on many walls. For here we are not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead, so long as reason is left free to combat it. So we had this idea of ourselves as being fearless, committed to the truth, willing to challenge convention, challenge received wisdom. That's what we're here to do. It is good to be provocative, we used to think. And so Thomas Jefferson very deliberately set up the University of Virginia. He thought a lot about architecture and social life and architecture. And so you might call this Jefferson's Academy. It was the academical village, the core of UVA. And I think what we managed to do in the United States that no other country did is we created a virtuous triangle which united a psychological state, which is discover mode. So there's a mindset that people can be in. There's a telos, the pursuit of truth, and there's an institution, a modern American research university, which pursues the truth. And because ours are residential, in Europe they usually weren't residential. You go to the school nearby, you live with your parents. But we developed in the late 19th and 20th centuries, we developed this virtuous triangle. And this, I think, is what led to our extraordinary success as a brand. We drew from ideas from Oxford and Cambridge, from other German universities, but the uniquely American research university, residential, centered on undergrad life and on research, a lot of fun and intellectual fun as well. It was a winning combination. So that's how we gained the trust of everyone. And then this happens. When everything changes around 2015, students are requesting trigger warnings for ancient texts, for Shakespeare, for all sorts of books. They're protesting any speaker that they find offensive, whether they're on the right or the left. They're asking for safe spaces. If a speaker comes to campus that offends them, some of them think they're in danger, they need help, they need support, they need a place they can be comforted. And we were all so puzzled, like, what do you mean? What do you mean you need a safe space? Just don't go to the talk. So it was very hard to understand. And what Greg and I concluded after analyzing all this is that there was a pattern of thinking, which is sort of the opposite of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a pattern of thinking about how everything is dangerous and threatening. You need safe spaces, you need trigger warnings for literature, you have to police microaggressions. What if someone says a word that offends someone? That person should be punished or stopped. So you have all of this stuff happening. It wasn't here in 2012. And then by 2016, it's not everywhere. It's not so much here at Boise, but it is certainly at the coastal universities and in the upper Midwest as well. And I've come to see now that what it really is identitarian. That's what makes it so, I think, pernicious. It's what's really bad for the students. They, as you saw, they are the ones who are most mentally ill, the ones who embrace this way of thinking. But it's also really bad for institutions, whether they be businesses or universities. So identitarianism, I think, is the key word here. And I define it very straightforwardly. It means putting identity first. I'm an identitarianist, let's say. I think that the most important thing is always group identity, and I'm going to teach you, if you want to analyze anything, Shakespeare, the economy, whatever, it's always about groups, racial groups, gender groups, identity groups. And secondly, those groups are not equal. Some are good and some are bad. That's how I define identitarianism. Now, it's very easy to see this if we talk about right-wing identitarianism, because it is literally white supremacy. It is literally the belief that white people are the best and that white people should be in control of things, and we need to put non-white people in their place. So that is very ugly. We'd be very reluctant to allow any hint of that on campus. But left-wing identitarianism is structurally very similar. It just reverses the order of the races. So it says, and this is the version based on intersectionality that really came in 2015, It says, okay, college freshmen, welcome to college. We're going to teach you. Here's a lens. We're going to give you this lens. We want you to put on these glasses. And now when you look out, you're not going to see just other people, other human beings. You're going to see intersecting lines of power and privilege. So some people are white, and that means they are privileged. Some people are non-white. That means that they are oppressed by the privileged people. And so you get all of these things. The original version of this in the 90s had Christians up here and Jews down here. But over time that has switched, so now Jews are up here and Palestinians or Arabs would be down here. So it's very flexible, it adapts over time, but the essential element is that the people above the line are bad because they're oppressing the people below the line. Now, if you're trying to run a large, diverse, multi-ethnic democracy, this is a really stupid thing to teach to young people. I mean, this is like, do you want to blow everything up? Like, what we're trying to do here is important and difficult, and you're telling people to judge people as members of groups and then hate the groups? Like, what are you doing? But that's, I think, what was done. There's, to be clear, there's an intellectual heritage. There are some important insights that come from intersectionality. It is true that if you just look at one at a time, you sometimes miss some unique indignities or obstacles that might hit, say, African American women. That was one of the original points of it. So I don't, it's an intellectual tradition that really has something to say. It's important to know about it. But as it got translated to campus, it became this moralistic good versus evil thing. And part of intersectionality is you look at intersections, and so the locus of oppression is especially the cisgender heterosexual white male. Those are the really bad people. They're the cause of our problems. So I think what happened as this swept in, because this wasn't really there, it was in a few departments before 2015, but it really swept into prominence after 2015. And so what it does is it converts this virtuous triangle. If you change the mindset, if you now have all these students in defend mode who see violence and victimization everywhere, and you change the telos of the university, it's not to find truth, it's to advance social justice, well, now it's incompatible with the institution that was set up over hundreds of years. It doesn't work. You get incoherence. And that's, I think, what we saw in that courtroom, in that hearing room in the House of Representatives. So just to give you an analogy, so this is a refrigerator. What's the telos of a refrigerator? What's a good refrigerator? It does a good job of keeping food cold, right? Now suppose you had a refrigerator and you decided, no, what we really want is a bathtub. We need a bathtub. So what we're going to do is we're going to lie the refrigerator on its back and we're going to plug up the leaks and we're going to make it a bathtub. You can do that, but it's not going to be a very good bathtub. And it certainly is not going to be able to keep your food cold anymore. You can't. You've given up that function. I guess you could put it in ice water or something. So this, I think, is what we've done to our universities. So if Harvard's original telos was veritas, but it changes to take on a more ideological mission, well, then you're stuck with the kind of incoherence that we saw from those three presidents. They could not explain what they were doing. They could not explain why they had the rules on speech that they had. They were incoherent. And it can explain the shocking spectacle of professors defending a plagiarist and saying it's not really plagiarism, even though we would expel any undergrad in a moment for doing a tenth of what Claudine Gay had done. So I think this is how we destroyed our brand. We allowed, our focus on identity meant that it's identity that matters, not excellence, not merit. People are promoted or hired based on identity. And honesty is punished. Most of the big blow-ups in higher ed early on, 2015, 2016, were because someone wrote a memo or an email questioning a DEI policy. That was the fastest way to get canceled in higher ed, was to say anything critical of DEI. And again, if that's what we did, well, why should Republicans and centrists and libertarians, why should they trust us? So that, I think, is how we brought this upon ourselves. We sacrificed our professionalism, or we allowed pressures. Look, most professors want to do their work. They're not ideological. This is not about the average professor. It's not about the average member of Gen Z. But the dynamics changed so that the activists could have a lot more influence and intimidate people. I think that's what happened. And that brings us to the third point, structural stupidity. So we had this notion of fearlessness, and this is the way we thought of ourselves. For any older academics here, there was a magazine called Lingua Franca in the 90s. It was fun, it was irreverent, and there was this, academic life used to be playful. There were jokes, there was a sense of trying new things. And then things changed. I think this cartoon captures sort of what changed about society. It used to be, if you were wrong, well, you might be wrong, but in 2017, you're wrong, so we're coming for you. We're going to destroy you. We're going to get you fired. And so I wrote an essay in The Atlantic with my friend Tobias Rose Stockwell on how exactly this happened. And I wrote another one on how social media is now, because it facilitates so much intimidation, it's doing some things that I think are knocking over the Tower of Babel, are making our liberal democracy very unstable. And so very briefly, the key thing from the technology side is that early social media was not destructive or divisive. They used to be called social networking systems. You put up your page on MySpace or Facebook, and you link to other people's pages, and they can see what you're up to, you can see what they're up to. That sounds good. You're just connecting people. But around 2009, Facebook invents the share button, Twitter invents the retweet button, and one of the engineers who worked on that, when he saw the first Twitter mobs forming, because with the retweet button, you can, if you retweet something and then 50 people retweet yours, you can get to thousands of people in minutes. You can get to millions of people in a few hours. So he saw these mobs forming and said, it's as though we just handed a loaded weapon to a 4-year-old. Now, the metaphor that I found helpful is it's not exactly a gun. It's not like everyone has a gun and can kill people. It's more like, what if everyone was given a dart gun? It shoots metal darts. You have an unlimited supply. You can shoot as many darts as you want into anyone. Anyone you don't like, just shoot a dart into them. Shame them, attack them. They can't really do anything to you. I mean, they can try to shoot a dart back, but if you've got 50 people attacking one person, that one person can't exactly dart the 50 people who are darting him. So this is why I think life changed. It happened in institutions on the left. It also happened, there aren't that many on the right, but it happened to some extent there too, as I'll show in a moment. The people who love darting, most of us don't want to shoot anybody, but people on the far left, the far right, trolls who are just jerks who enjoy being jerks, and Russian agents were very, very effective in using social media to intimidate and attack people. And what happens when any wrong word can get you darted, can get you attacked, can get you reported, can get you in trouble? It's like you're walking on eggshells. And that's the way a lot of us have felt in the higher ed, that we're teaching on eggshells. I didn't get that sense from the professors here at Boise State, but at the schools I've been at the schools more on the coasts, this was a big thing. Like, don't say anything controversial. Cut it out of the syllabus. It's not worth the trouble of having a student file a report against you. A student here, an essay about walking on eggshells, a student at Smith. I'll let you read it yourself, but she describes how she came there. She wanted to have a great intellectual time, but she found that if she said anything out of line, she'd be shamed. I began to voice my opinion less often to avoid being berated and judged by a community that claims to represent the free expression of ideas. I learned with every other student to walk on eggshells for fear that I may say something offensive. It wasn't like this in 2012. But by 2016, 2017 it was. So I've called this feature structural stupidity. That is, just like there's structural racism, where you might have nobody's a racist, but the system could end up having unseen or unjustified obstacles to members of a certain racial group. So that makes sense. Theoretically, that structural racism makes sense. But in the same way, structural stupidity makes sense. You can have a collection of brilliant people, but if they're put together in a way that if anyone questions anyone else's ideas on key topics, they will be darted, they will be attacked, they will be shamed, they will be shunned. What happens? Well, since the people on the far left are the ones who are going to attack people on the center left, so the center left goes quiet, moderates go quiet, and then you get all these extreme ideas that end up backfiring, and nobody says anything about them. Now, We see the same thing happening on the right. They don't control epistemic institutions, knowledge-generating institutions. But I think we've seen this in the Republican Party, where the Republican Party used to have a lot of center-right, Rockefeller Republicans, regular social conservatives. But those have been sort of taken out, and so we're seeing that party move to the right. Moderates and centrists went quiet long ago. And so whenever you don't have viewpoint diversity, because anyone who voices a dissenting view will be darted, will be attacked, shamed, humiliated, possibly driven out, you get structural stupidity. And this is why I think the public has lost a lot of trust in all these institutions, which are progressive, very progressive in their politics. And I think this is why we see, in my opinion, I think the Republican Party has been moving in ways that I just find hard to believe on certain things that have been said. I myself am a centrist. I'm not in any party, but I'm just kind of shocked at the extremity on the far left and the far right, which I think is damaging very important institutions. So that's my presentation as to what's gone wrong. Now I'll just end with some thoughts about what to do. And these ideas about what to do flow directly from what I just said about what's wrong. So what if we just reverse the things that I said have happened? What if we find a way to make discover mode replace defend mode, or truth replace social justice as the telos, as the purpose? It's fine if students pursue social justice, but the university needs to be committed to the pursuit of truth, not to any political agenda. So how would that work? Well, let's look. One thing that I recommend to you, because the mental health crisis is everywhere, is teach CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. This is what Greg and I talked about in our book. Greg is prone to depression, and he had a suicidal depression in 2007 when he almost killed himself. But he took treatment, he learned cognitive behavioral therapy, and he says it saved his life. You learn to recognize cognitive distortions such as these. Well, if we're going to teach our students not to catastrophize, not to do black and white or dichotomous thinking, not to overgeneralize, not to reason based on their emotions, this isn't just clinical psychology. This is critical thinking. This is good thinking. So CBT is very effective, very inexpensive. It'll reduce the rates of depression and anxiety. Oh, and by the way, it'll teach the exact critical thinking skills that we want all college students to have. It's also really, really cheap. So this is Seth Gillihan, who wrote a very good book on CBT. And I suppose, I don't know how much you'd have to pay to hire him, but let's say to hire one therapist for a year, a school would have to pay, I don't know, let's say $180,000, I don't know what it would be. For $40,000, you could buy 4,000 copies of his book and give one to every incoming freshman. I don't know how big Boise State is, but you could do that. It wouldn't be very expensive. So that's one suggestion for how to help get students out of defend mode. If we reduce their anxiety and depression, we will increase their curiosity. Another way is to use the Perspectives program from Constructive Dialogue. So this is, Andrew mentioned this, we founded this originally within Heterodox Academy, but then it branched out on its own. We have this really great program. It's 6 30-minute modules. You do it on your own, but then there are activities where you do it with your classmates, you talk with your classmates. And we found that in random assignment experiments, affective polarization, the degree to which you hate the other side, goes down for those who got the treatment, who took the Perspectives program. And intellectual humility goes up. So we have data that it works, students like it, and I just found out today that you're actually doing it here at Boise State in a special program, but you have a license. So how many of our professors here at Boise State? Okay, I would encourage you, especially if you're teaching like a freshman or sophomore course or political science or anything where cross-partisan might be helpful, check it out. You already have a license, so you can use it in your class. So that's, if we can get Discover mode to replace Defend mode, our universities would be much healthier, it would be more fun to be a student and professor. For Truth to replace social justice, this takes leadership, and a lot of schools have had poor leadership. So a key example was MIT. Dorian Gray was a professor at Chicago. He was invited to give a prestigious lecture on exoplanets, on planets and other suns. But he had written an essay in Newsweek critical of DEI. So some MIT students freaked out and said, well, this is a danger to us. He's opposed to DEI. We can't have him speak. And some dean canceled his talk. And the president of MIT backed her up, did not reverse it and say, wait, no, we made a mistake. No, of course he should speak. No, he backed her up. So this was a complete shame for higher ed. Princeton, Robbie George at Princeton, who you had here on stage. Robbie George just hosted it at Princeton. It was very successful. And so it takes leadership, and we've not seen much good leadership in higher ed in the last 10 years. So how can we escape our national shame, where higher ed's become the punchline of late-night comic jokes? So stop being weak leaders. This was one of the worst of all the fiascos at Evergreen State College. The students took the president hostage, basically. They wouldn't allow him to go to the bathroom. They ordered him around. This is a quote you can see in one of the videos. And when they say, put your hands down, he says, my hands are down. So this kind of capitulation to intimidation was just astonishing. And it happened many, many times. Not this bad that I know of, but the basic pattern was very similar. And so my view is that weak leaders that we've seen often, they're afraid of their students. They're afraid to criticize bad behavior. Almost nobody has ever been punished for shouting down a speaker in this country. You'd think they'd be expelled for shouting down a visiting speaker, but nothing happens to them. They validate the worst story about their institutions. They validate the use of intimidation. So I think weak leadership is part of what got us into this. In contrast, the few leaders who actually stood up for academic values were almost always smashingly successful. So at Oberlin, of all places, the president, Marvin, I forget his last name, said, when the students came in with their long list of demands, and they, so you have to do this, and we demand this, he said, I will not respond directly to any document that explicitly rejects the notion of collaborative engagement. Many of its demands contravene principles of shared government, and it contains personal attacks. So he defended his staff, which almost no president has done. And guess what? The students just went away because they had no argument. They didn't know what to do. They'd never seen anyone oppose them. So it takes leadership. Strong leaders are not afraid of their students. They acknowledge valid points, as that president did. He said, they made many good points. I'm very happy to talk with them. I welcome them to come in and talk with me in my office. So it's going to take strong leadership, and we're beginning to see that. We are beginning, finally, in the last year, to see some university presidents criticizing and condemning students who shout down a visiting speaker. So leaders must guard the telos of truth. They must talk about anti-fragility and viewpoint diversity. Ruth Simmons, the first African-American president of an Ivy League school, was great on this. After there was a visiting speaker that students tried to cancel, she said, learning is the antithesis of comfort. We don't need any collision avoidance technology here. And leaders must respond wisely to crisis. I won't go into this in detail, and things are calming down a little bit. In 2016, 17, 18, and then especially in 2020, there was a lot of fear. Things seem a little less fear-driven now. And finally, curiosity and love of learning. Basically, intellectual virtues we should be emphasizing. At Heterodox Academy, we hired 2 years ago John Tomasi as our new president. He was a professor at Brown. He left a tenured professorship at Brown to run HXA, and one of his big initiatives is he has a great essay on curiosity. That should be at the heart of everything we do in a university. That's what makes learning fun. That's what drives us forward. And so at HXA, we have a lot of resources that can help you have a more vibrant culture, a more vibrant academic culture. We have an annual conference. I invite all the faculty members to come to our annual conference. It's in Chicago this year, June 6th to 8th. I co-produced a book of John Stuart Mill's on liberty, just chapter 2, edited to be very readable for today's undergraduates. And you have a chapter here. You have an HXA chapter here on campus. So let me just look. So raise your hand if you are a professor who is a member of the Heterodox Academy chapter. Raise your hand high. Okay, good. So look around so you can see if you know any of them. You can go talk to them. Okay, put your hands down, please. And now raise your hand if you are a professor here or administrator. You're an insider to the university who is not a member of Heterodox Academy. Please raise your hand high. Okay, so I invite all of you to join. It's free. Just go to heterodoxacademy.org. It's free, and you'll be connected with other other professors who think that we should have viewpoint diversity. We're actually evenly divided between left and right. And our conference is amazing because nobody cares what side you're on. We all just love universities and want them to be better. And we started a new Center for Academic Pluralism. So if you want to spend 6 months or a year in New York City and be part of a small group, if your research has something to do with the value of pluralism, viewpoint diversity, you should apply. So in conclusion, we once had one of the most respected brands in the world, but we blew it. We lost the trust of the right and the center. I've told you a story of how that happened. It was a number of factors that all came together in the mid-2010s. And I've suggested what we can do now to escape from it and restore the grandeur of America's universities. That's my talk. I look forward to your questions, and here you can go for more information. Thank you. Okay, so thank you. So there are microphones at each end, and especially what I'd like to do is, does anyone here disagree with me? Does anyone here think I got something wrong? Especially students, I said some things about your generation. Okay, I'd invite you to come up, and if you please go ahead and ask the first question. Anybody else? Because I love giving talks to receptive audiences, but I don't learn anything if you agree with me. So if you have a criticism, please come up and let's hear it.
Hello?
Yes.
The fellow who introduced you suggested the students would go first. I guess I'm a student on some level.
Well, you're right. Yeah, you're right. No, we got two. That's right. Either if you're a student or you disagree with me, please come up. Go ahead. Okay. Let's see. Are you a student over there? Okay. Why don't you go first and then you go second? Yeah. Okay.
Hi, I'm a Gen Zer. So yeah, we talked a lot about my generation. I was curious what your thoughts are about representation of our generation and how a lot of people in Gen Z don't feel heard by their college or politics and legislation or presidency.
Okay, that's a great question. And this is a fundamental question in democracy. We want people to be heard. We want to hear from all constituencies. We don't want anyone to feel shut out. To some extent, that's just always the case about youth, except for the baby boomers in the 1960s who had a real revolution, and boy, did we hear them. So let me give you my own, I would say almost frustration with your voice, which is this. I'm looking for members of Gen Z who disagree with me, who defend what's going on. I can't find them. I'm looking for members of Gen Z who do agree with me, who are writing about it. I do find some stuff. In general, my sense is Gen Z is just not saying much outside of its bubble because you spend so much time talking to each other on social media. It's kind of a closed world, and it takes up so much of your time that very few members of your generation have written any books that have been noticed. Very few are even writing magazine articles. You're making videos, you're doing posts, but that doesn't add up to anything. So I realize I'm not being very gracious to you and saying, yes, you're right, we need to listen to you more. What do you say? I'm saying, well, you need to speak up more in forms that we might read. What do you think?
Yeah, my counter to that is, I was born in '99 and I grew up on social media. I definitely felt the effects of the statistics you were talking about with young women. Like I was part of that, which I'm gonna say was just uncomfortable for me to listen to because I related so well.
You did so well, meaning was it good for you? The social media was good for you?
No.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
I related to the statistics.
Oh, I'm sorry,
which
yes. Okay.
that is sometimes uncomfortable to hear.
I see, okay.
Whenever you're a part of a group like that. But I think it's important to understand those statistics and those things about free speech, about suicide rates, about social media. And even though I grew up on it, I'm very aware of those effects. And I think educating Gen Z about the effects of social media is super important and gets people to go outside that box. But I also think advocating for Gen Z, kind of like what you're doing, and educating people who are part of older generations is super important. It's hard whenever you do feel like you need to protect things. And I don't agree with everything that Gen Z is doing. I just want to say that. But I feel like it's hard whenever you're trying to protect certain rights and free speech when other people don't listen and are in positions of power that won't even accept how you feel because you are Gen Z. Does that make sense?
Oh, if people are dismissing you just because, yeah, well then that's not just stereotyping, but prejudice, and they should not be treated that way, especially in a university setting, I hope.
I mean, even in your talk today, I heard some people kind of laugh or scoff about some statistics or like left and versus right, which I feel like America shouldn't be as divided as it is.
Yeah. So I hear you. I think you're observing some of the trends in this country towards greater polarization. You always have stereotyping going on. You always have stereotyping between generations. But thank you for saying that educating everyone is important, because that's what I'm hoping to do with my book. I hope you'd see in my book and in my talk, I'm not blaming Gen Z for anything. We did this to you by not giving you independence, by letting you, so there's no blame here. And I explain how it is that we fell into this without realizing what we were doing. But yeah, we have a lot to change. And so I would urge you to regain control of your attention, spend a lot less time putting out ephemera, and try to do something big. Try to write something big. And I guarantee you'll get an audience, because us older people, we want to understand you, but you're not saying anything that we can hear. So thank you. Okay, please go ahead.
So I don't actually disagree with you as a whole, because most of what you said I loved and I agree with, and it was very inspiring. There's really only one little part that I wanted to push back against a little bit or ask you about, and that was when you mentioned some ways we can deal with this. What I would say, you're acknowledging this sort of the dart syndrome, this I'm going to get you, and that spirit of the condemnation, I suppose. And you mentioned at one point, how do we deal with that? And well, what we can do is we need to condemn it. If I heard you rightly, I mean, I think there's on one side there's a need to. I agree with the need to make a space for free inquiry and open dialogue, but does that necessitate condemning extremism? And if so, are we in danger of perpetuating the very condemnation that we find so distasteful about what they're doing?
Thank you. Yeah, I wouldn't want to be condemning people on the far left or the far right as bad people or as necessarily wrong. We need to hear from a variety of perspectives to get at the truth. What I do want to do is slightly disempower them. And what I mean by that, it sounds terrible, we shouldn't disempower anybody. What I mean is, in our political system, the extremes have always had more influence, especially in closed primary states. That's always been the case. It's a problem with our democracy. When social media comes on, the extremes become super empowered, and that's where things begin to fail. So I want us to get to a point where institutions are led by leaders who are responsive to their constituents, not just to the dart throwers on the extremes. So I see it as a problem not of the average, but of the dynamics that changed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, on that side?
So I'm a teaching assistant and engineering grad student, and a fan of Peter Boghossian, another heterodox thinker. He claims that the ideology is most entrenched in the College of Education, and I recently attended a Center for Teaching and Learning workshop that kind of confirmed his suspicions. So I guess my question is, where would we start with the colleges of education?
Well, I could sort of say what's in my heart, which is burn them all down, but let me be a little more, nuanced. Peter is right that education is among the most ideological fields at a university. There are others, social work, all the various area studies, anthropology. There are a bunch that are very ideological. But education is tasked with producing the teachers of the next generation. And what education schools are producing, not just the teachers, also a lot of DEI staff come out, they have PhDs in education. So I do think that education schools, we should question whether they're appropriate to be at universities. If their mission is not education and research, if it's ideological, we should question that. Now, I can say, for schools like, at NYU and Teachers College, Columbia, I think there's some real problems. Here, I don't know. In talking with faculty today, it sounds like things are not really that bad. So, Peter's right about the elite schools, but I would not say burn down all the ed schools. Let's just burn down the top 20, and then let those that are really trying to train teachers, let them train teachers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I enjoyed your talk, and I agreed with almost everything, but I did feel like maybe there was an issue that you didn't talk about that I wish you had. And so when he was giving his farewell address, the military-industrial complex address in 1961, President Eisenhower suggested that maybe the what he called the free university had already started to become corrupted, that curiosity was being replaced by chasing government grants. That's one datum. Another is, university administrators don't want to lose tuition money. And so part of their, stance or lack of a stance can be attributed to that concern. Another one is those buttons, the retweet button and the other share button, thank you, are about I'm going to say the inordinate love of money. And it seems like a lot of the things that you talked about really coalesce around that, but you didn't mention it. I just wonder what your thoughts are.
No, that's a great point. You're right. I tend not to, even though I'm a professor in a business school, I tend not to do economic analyses of things. But it's always relevant, or it's almost always relevant. And the specific examples you gave are very relevant. I've been focusing on the period since 2014, and I don't think money is behind what's happening since 2014. But you're right to point out that the universities have been affected by mega economic trends, especially there's the consumer revolution, the customer is always right. As universities became less places focused on faculty and teaching, where you didn't think about a climbing wall or an infinite pool, you thought about, the dorms were cramped and the food was bad. But gradually, competitive market forces among American universities, they compete on those assets. Now you have to raise tuition, it's expensive. So so there's this kind of a financialization, a movement away from sort of the more pure practice of teaching and learning. You begin to get people hired to run universities who are not professors. There's much more the idea in the 80s that, business people actually can run things and university professors generally can't. So there were a lot of moves to make us less special and more like a corporation. And that fed back and changed a lot of things. And the customer's always right. And that, I think, is part of the reason why many of the university presidents in the 1960s did stand up to student protests that they thought were inappropriate, whereas now they don't. And I think it is so thank you. You're right. I do tend to neglect economic analyses. I shouldn't. But I think what the intensity that's happening now is a moralistic, quasi-religious thing, not an economic thing mostly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes? Okay. Also, please introduce yourself. Like, what's your name, and what's your, are you a student or what?
Okay. My name is Matthew Roy. I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor, and I'm also an adjunct faculty teaching mathematics and psychology. So I'm a little bit scattered, but I think I'll try to come out with two specific questions. The first one, the term that you came up with, identitarianism, to me just sounds like tribalism, which has always...
Exactly. Yeah, identitarianism, yes.
So conflict has always been lack of resources or religion, creed, tribe. And so I think that is happening now. One of my thoughts about actually the stark rise in self-injurious behavior is there's not so many external threats, right? This is happening in countries where women are not being, drugged out of their beds and murdered and gang raped. So I guess the question in all of that is, how do you protect individualism, which has skyrocketed? I think social media is very unique in that it kind of emphasizes individualism, but also people still want that cohesion and that sense of belonging, which obviously they're not getting. So that would be the first one. Like, how do you kind of get
I might only be able to deal with one, so let's just focus it on that. Yeah, you want me to address that one? Because I think I'll lose it if we go on to the second one. Okay. So individualism is a really important feature of the last several hundred years. There's been a rise since the Enlightenment, a rise of individualism, artists sign their works, whereas before then they didn't sign their works. There was no sense of an artist as a... so we do get, with modernity, we do get much more individualism. And overall, I'd say that was a good thing. And when you look at the happiest countries before 2015, the happiest countries were the Scandinavian countries and the Anglo countries, and then also Switzerland and a couple others. These are the most individualistic countries. They granted freedom, rights, access. They created very high quality of life. They were the happiest countries on earth. And their young people were the happiest young people on earth. And those are exactly the countries that were high on individualism, where once social media came in, it's those kids, and especially those girls, who plunged. And other analyses that I didn't show you show it's the same thing for religion. In families where the kid says, religion is very important to me, they didn't plunge very much. In families that say, no, religion is not important to me, they're the ones who plunged. So I think individualism had a lot to recommend it, and in terms of productivity, creativity, and even happiness, until this recent era. And then when everything moves online, the students who are not rooted in the real world, the students who don't have to go to church on Sunday, who are not members of a tight religious group or whatever, those students who were rooted, they didn't get washed away. They had roots in the real world. But the secular progressive students who didn't have those roots, they spent more time on social media. They were swept away by some really terrible ideas developed on Tumblr around 2013, 2014 about identity. And those are the ones who became most depressed and anxious. So I think individualism, I think, is in general a good thing, but so is community. And when individualism is done in ways that shatter community, well then, yeah, it's bad for the people and for the society. So, if you have a very short second question, I'll take it.
Well, I mean, you kind of hit on it. It was with religion, and it kind of also ties into what she was saying, which is, you know, these Anglo-Saxon economically
Advanced.
Yeah, countries are the ones that are increasingly less religious.
Yeah, that's right.
And so again, it's like, how do you find that balance between not going to this extreme or
right.
going to a religion that, you know,
Yeah.
kills people or abuses certain large swaths of the community?
Yeah.
Like, where do you find
Right.
kind of
Okay.
that sweet
So
spot?
I think the key thing is to realize what kids need is not necessarily religion. Religion, it turns out to be really good for families, for kids, for society. I'm not religious myself, but I've become a big fan of religion for its social effects, at least in the United States. But what kids really need is to be rooted in the real world. So especially if you're not a religious family, if your kids don't have faith or community, try really hard to get them to play team sports, to have a team, a gang, to do volunteer work, to do something that's not on a screen, that's with other people. I think that's very important to anchor kids. Thank you. Okay, please.
Hi, my name is Amelia. I'm an undergraduate student here majoring in computer science and sociology. And my question was about your intersectionality graph and moralism. So as a student of sociology and feminist theory, I've read a lot of intersectionality work. And from my perspective, a lot of these theories can get twisted into blaming the individual, like you were saying, instead of the systems of oppression. And so my question for you is, how do we change this conversation of acknowledging systems of oppression instead of misconstruing these teachings into blaming individuals?
Thank you. So Kimberly Crenshaw, one of the leading theorists, not the originator, but really one of the people who developed it a lot, she has a really great TED Talk. I urge you to watch it. She really explains the history of this idea, how it grew out of legal theory, how black women in particular were often, it was not recognized that there was discrimination against them, like in GM, I think it was, or car companies, because we hire a lot of African Americans, men on the production line. We hire a lot of women in pink collar jobs, white women, but we just don't hire many black women. And so now, was that a system of oppression? Sometimes it might be, but part of what my mission is to sort of reduce the moralism of everything. Because once you adopt a moralistic framework, you go blind to nuance. You see good versus evil. And so I certainly would not deny inequality, But I do think that a lot of what is presented to students as oppressor-victim, that distorts things. And it's just much better to say, okay, we're getting differential outcomes here. Why? And usually it's some systemic thing, which we could fix, but to label it oppression, systems of oppression, I think that makes it very hard to solve the problem. So I'm sort of, if you could take intersectionality and pull out a lot of the moralism, then I would say, yeah, that's a good sociological insight. So thank you.
All right. Hello. My name is Ann Snellgrove McCarricker. I graduated from Boise State University in social science, sociology, and political science back in 2021. I'm now an adjunct teaching a university foundations course, and I'm a research assistant with the sociology department. The slight pushback I offer is in nothing that you said. It's actually about, I think, the viewpoint that you got of Boise State University. And I think the people who showed up to your presentations are not the people who are part of the problem here. I come from the sociology department, a field that I believe in. I have professors in that department that I respect. At the same time, like, my heart is pounding right now because if any one of them is in the audience, like, I fear that they will call me insert white supremacist racist, because like doing this research that I'm doing with them, some of the professors, some of these conclusions that they're coming to on what is white supremacy, what is racism, I go, are you kidding me? That's what we're calling white supremacy now? And so I guess part of that was just like to offer that perspective, and I guess the flip side of that, or the question in my coming up here is, you know, someone who's in my position, who, like, there are people I respect, there's people I would love a letter of recommendation for one day, but I actually don't feel like I can speak up in that department at all. Like, I'm literally terrified of them and some of the faculty that I've worked with and that I've taken classes with and that I respect. And so, like, what advice would you offer to someone in my position? Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Yeah. So I'm really sorry to hear that, although you do confirm a lot of my stereotypes about sociology. So I love sociology. I was really turned on when I read Emile Durkheim in graduate school. It really blew my mind, and it's informed all my work. I love the classical sociologists. I think sociology is possibly the most important field right now, more than psychology. What we're going through is a gigantic sociological change. The technology is affecting everything. We need good sociologists. As far as I can tell, they're AWOL. They're not on the job. They're all off protesting Israel. So we desperately need good sociology. And I can name 4 or 5 good sociologists, but that's about it. I'm sorry, I don't mean that I just mean that are working on the crisis that we're facing, and that includes issues of race and racism, which have to be approached, again, in this non-moralistic way. When you come to it with preconceptions about oppressor-victim, you cannot solve it. You will not get the right answer. And guess what? No one will tell you that, because they're afraid that if they do, they'll be called racist. That's the heart of the problem. And this, I think, is how DEI has really gotten itself in such a pickle, because DEI made itself structurally stupid. That is, whenever anyone wrote a thoughtful memo, Erica Christakis writing about why maybe Halloween costume guidance from the university is not a good idea, when anyone wrote a thoughtful memo, they were destroyed. They were shamed. They were traumatized. I shouldn't say traumatized. I don't want to do concept creep. So what I'm saying is, because of the way DEI developed on campus, attacking any criticism, that meant that it never improved, that all kinds of programs were tried. Trigger warnings, bias response teams, diversity training, none of these things work. Some of them backfire, but nobody could say that. And so I can't give you career advice. You see the perils. But what I can say is that sociology is absolutely essential, that we need good sociology, and that my advice to you is think about how you could state critiques in a way that will not cause an allergic reaction. What I urge all of my undergrads to do, and what I assign, is to read Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Also, to avoid saying things in large groups. Talk to people. So, I think it said no recording is allowed, I think. but take one of these professors aside or sometime and gently broach the subject, because they might actually share your doubts, but they can't say anything either. And so I would urge you to not be silent, but also don't be reckless and just charge in and say, so you're going to have to develop, this is what I tell to conservative students who come to me who want to go into the university. I say, please come, we need you, and there is a place for you. You're going to have extra sensitive social skills. You're going to have to be very diplomatic. But not just that you can do it, but we need you to do it. So are you thinking of a career in the academy? You're thinking of going to grad school?
Yeah, I was going to go to grad school here, actually, and now being back at the university after a year off, I thought, no, this school's a joke.
Oh, okay. Well, just by the way, universities are huge, diverse places, and there are problems in some departments. And so I hope your problem is mostly with the sociology department, not with the rest of the university.
I've got my structural critiques of the types of classes being offered, like how the education department removed philosophy of education for master's and PhD students.
I can guess why they did that.
So.
Yeah, right. Okay. All right, so we've established that there are two places here that are causing problems. Okay. Thank you. Yes.
Well, thank you, Dr. Haidt, for your talk. I really appreciated it. My name is Ethan Lahaug. I'm an undergraduate here studying political science and psychology, thanks to your book that I read when I was a lot younger, The Righteous Mind. So thank you for that. My question is about something you mentioned, which is that, to disagree with the other speaker, I'm a student, so I don't have the faculty perspective. For me, as a conservative student, it's been very easy to be a student at Boise State. I can say what I want without retribution. I can have my beliefs, I can articulate them. And that's not true at a lot of the Ivy League universities. And so I'm wondering, well, first of all, is that the case, and why would that be? And what I'm wondering specifically is that in Boise, 5 blocks down from Boise State is the Idaho legislature, where we have a Republican governor, a Republican House, and a Republican Senate. All of these high-level universities are in Democratic trifecta states. Do you think there's any political impact? Like, is what's restraining our culture from becoming this? Is it the political sphere, or is it the people that are here?
No, that's a great question. There's a lot to it. And I'm sorry to say, I know I have to go at 8:30. I'll take one question after this. I'm really sorry. I have to catch the 6 o'clock flight out of here tomorrow morning. So I'll stay for just a few minutes afterwards, but I'll have to go fairly soon. And we're supposed to end at 8:30. As to your question, one hypothesis I have, why it's mostly in the Northeast and on the West Coast, is that in most of the country, and especially in the South and in the mountain states, people are polite. And if you're polite, that means that if someone says something that you think is maybe a little off, you try to minimize it and smooth things over. But if you're in a prestige economy that gives you points for shooting darts, if you get rewarded, the more you can call something or someone racist, the more prestige you get. Well, then if someone says anything that you can link to white supremacy, you're going to dart them. And that's why we sort of plummeted in the coastal schools especially. The social dynamic changed once social media made it easy to do that, and you didn't have norms of politeness restraining it. So that's part of it. It's also the case that at the top schools, I think the finding was 60% of the students are from the top 1% economically, 60%. Whereas at most schools, and I imagine at Boise State, you have much more representation. It's mostly rich kids who have the luxury of saying, I'm going to spend my 4 years protesting. Most students want to get an education and get a job. And so they're more pragmatic. And that's why we don't have the problem in business schools. The students are pragmatic. They want to get a job. So it's especially these more performative areas that you get the sort of the extreme politics. I think that's a lot of it. Thank you. So, okay, I'll just take one more question. I'm sorry for the others. And then I'll hang up about 5 or 10 minutes if you want to come up as individuals afterwards. And then, okay, please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jaden. I'm from Northwest Nazarene University. I'm a student there. Sophomore, studying psychology.
Great.
And my question would be, we just read in our class that's here, we just read Righteous Mind as part of our books for this semester. And I would want to ask the question, how did you get into moral psychology, and how do you think someone like me could get into moral psychology, or just find more resources about that?
Okay, sure. So my own path was I didn't know what to do with my life. I was a philosophy major undergrad, but I took some psych courses, and then I was programming computers afterwards. I didn't know what to do. And I just kind of made a list of like what I wanted in my life and what I didn't. And it said I should be a college professor. Like, it never occurred to me. And then I thought, what should I be a college professor of? And I thought, philosophy, psychology, AI, maybe, artificial intelligence. And I started applying in computer science. And on a fluke, I only got into Penn, and I ended up switching. I had a great talk with a professor who was studying thinking and decision making, and he had a side project on moral thinking. So I ended up working with him, and then once it was actually a little dry and boring at first, but then once I brought in culture and emotion and looked at like purity and pollution and disgust and sexual taboos, that was really interesting, and I got really hooked. So my answer is, first of all, how I got in, it was a lot of flukes, and that's true. When you ask successful people, ask older people, how'd you get to where they are? There's a lot of chance, a lot of, you met someone that so just be open to possibilities, meet people, talk to people, read widely. Are you applying to PhD programs, or you're currently an undergrad?
Currently an undergrad.
Yeah. So are you planning on going to graduate school?
Yeah, if I can make it.
Okay, yeah. So, so despite all the criticisms of higher ed, it's still an amazing place to be. We get paid to think and read and write and talk with smart people at interesting things. So, yeah. So I would encourage you to give it a try. At graduate school, PhD programs, you actually get paid to go in most of them. So you don't, maybe not quite enough to live on, but you don't really incur debt. So I would encourage you to give it a try. If you're curious, actually, let me ask you a question. If you had to make your living, you can choose one: people, things, or ideas. What's it going to be?
People.
Okay, so you might consider a master's degree then, meaning. By which I mean a PhD is a research degree. It is to become a professor and immerse yourself in books and ideas. And if you love that, then it's amazing. But if you want to have a more applied emphasis and work with people, there are all kinds of things related to psychology that you can do, but it's going to be more on the applied side, not hiding away for 5 years to write a dissertation. So, there's plenty of room for you in psychology. And you might be right for a PhD program, but just on that one little diagnostic thing, maybe, I'd suggest more the applied side. Okay, thank you
so much.
Thank you. Okay, thank you all. Oh, Andrew has.
Continue to thank Professor Haidt for his excellent talk. Thank you for your engagement. Thank you for coming. We'll see you in October for David Brooks. Safe travels. Have a good night.